Hi there, how is everyone doing? I hope you're all well and ready to relax and enjoy today's video. I have some weird and scary cult stories for you. Before we dive in, I'd love to know what type of stories you enjoy listening to, especially before going to sleep. Don't forget to subscribe to join our Fright family. Without further ado, let's begin our trip for today. This story took place several years ago in a remote region outside the United States. I'll keep the exact location vague for privacy reasons. My name is Ella, and what happened that night started as a simple hiking trip with my close friend, Mia. We never imagined the fun adventure would turn into something straight out of a nightmare. Mia's then partner had suggested the trail to us, claiming it was serene and scenic. I had recently relocated to this country, seeking new experiences. As an avid hiker with a love for exploring new trails across different continents, I thought I had seen it all. But nothing could have prepared us for what lay ahead. The hike began like any other, with laughter and admiration for nature's beauty. But as we ventured deeper into the woods, strange markings began to appear on the trees and rocks. These symbols were unusual, geometric shapes mixed with abstract designs, and they seemed deliberately placed. At first, we thought they were just an odd detail of the trail. As we pressed on, the symbols became more frequent and intricate, as if leading us somewhere. They exuded an unsettling energy, like they belonged to an ancient ritual or belief system we couldn't understand. Then we heard chanting. At first, it was faint and almost melodic, drawing us in with curiosity. But as we followed the sound, we stumbled upon something we wish we hadn't. A group of individuals dressed in dark, hooded robes gathered around a blazing fire. There were about 20 of them, their faces obscured by masks or painted symbols. Some held candles. Others stood motionless, all chanting in a language we couldn't recognize. At the center of their circle was a large altar adorned with candles and objects we couldn't identify. Then, something happened that made our blood run cold. A small animal was brought forward and, in a horrifying moment, was sacrificed. The air was thick with tension, and the ritual seemed to intensify. Suddenly, one of the figures noticed us. The chanting stopped. Heads turned, and just like that, our presence became the focus of their attention. Panic overtook us. We ran as fast as our legs could carry us, the adrenaline coursing through our veins, giving us a burst of speed we didn't know we had. The eerie chants had turned into shouts, and the heavy sound of footsteps behind us echoed in the stillness of the forest. Every snap of a twig and rustle of leaves sent waves of terror through us. The darkness felt alive, closing in around us as we desperately searched for a way to escape. Our path twisted unpredictably, and we struggled to navigate through the dense undergrowth. Neither of us spoke, too breathless and terrified to exchange words. Suddenly, through the shadows, we spotted a structure. An old abandoned cabin hidden among the trees. It looked like something out of a horror movie. The roof sagged in places, the wooden walls were weathered and gray, and ivy had begun to reclaim it. But to us, it was salvation. We dashed inside, slamming the rickety door behind us and sliding the old wooden bolt across to lock it. The cabin smelled of mildew and decay. Its windows were small and dusty, and the faint light of the moon barely illuminated the cramped interior. Our breaths came in ragged gasps as we pressed our ears against the door, listening for the sounds of pursuit. Footsteps approached. They were slow and deliberate now, as if the cultists knew they had us cornered. A low murmur of voices reached us through the cracks in the walls, followed by a soft rattle as someone tested the door. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure they could hear it. We knew we had to be ready. Frantically, we searched the cabin for anything we could use as a weapon. Our hands brushed against cobwebs, damp wood, and dusty shelves. Finally, in a dark corner, we found an old axe. It was heavy, its blade rusted and dull, but it gave us a small shred of hope. Mia clutched it tightly while I scanned the room for something else we could use. And then, silence. The voices and footsteps stopped. We stood frozen, afraid to breathe. The stillness was broken by a sound that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, a chorus of distant wolf howls. It was eerie, otherworldly, and seemed to come from all directions. The cultists outside shifted nervously. We could hear their shuffling footsteps. For a moment, it seemed like they were retreating. We stayed inside the cabin for what felt like hours, too scared to move, too afraid to look outside. Finally, we mustered the courage to peek through a crack in the door. The clearing outside was empty. The cultists were gone, as if they had vanished into thin air. We knew we couldn't stay there forever. The idea of spending the night in that cabin was unbearable. Gathering our strength, we opened the door cautiously and stepped into the moonlit forest. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. We began to make our way back to the trailhead, moving as quickly and quietly as we could. Just as relief started to creep in, thinking we might actually make it out, two figures emerged from the tree line ahead of us. They were dressed in the same dark robes, their faces hidden by masks. They stood still for a moment, watching us like predators sizing up their prey. And then they began to approach. The glint of long knives in their hands caught the moonlight, and a fresh wave of terror surged through me. My legs felt weak, but we turned to run. Just as they closed in, a deafening gunshot shattered the silence. The figures froze. From the distance, a voice shouted, commanding them to stop. Turning back, we saw a figure standing near the edge of the woods, a forest ranger. He held a rifle, and his powerful voice cut through the tension like a knife. The cultists hesitated, exchanged glances, then retreated into the shadows without a word. The ranger waved us over, his expression stern but reassuring. He led us back to safety, keeping his weapon ready in case the cultists returned. When we reached his outpost, we recounted everything that had happened. He immediately reported the incident, and authorities arrived to investigate. Though the police searched the area thoroughly, they found little evidence to support our story. The symbols we had seen earlier were gone, the fire extinguished, and there was no trace of the cultists. It was as if the entire night had been a twisted illusion. Days passed, and just when we thought we could move on, an ominous letter arrived in the mail. There was no return address, and the handwriting was messy and deliberate, as if meant to conceal the writer's identity. The message was chilling. "We know you saw us. You'll never be safe." We immediately reported it to the police, who took the letter as evidence. But without leads, there wasn't much they could do. The fear that someone was watching us lingered, and we both became hyper-vigilant. Over the next few weeks, reports of strange rituals in the area continued, but they eventually died down. Authorities arrested a few individuals for unrelated crimes in the woods, but none of them matched the description of the cultists we'd encountered. The case was eventually closed, leaving us with more questions than answers. I stopped hiking after that. What used to be a source of joy and peace became a source of fear. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, and the thought of venturing into the unknown was no longer thrilling. It was terrifying. To this day, I don't know who the cultists were, what their ritual meant, or why they targeted us. But one thing is certain, the woods are no longer a place of peace for me. They're a reminder of how quickly curiosity can turn into danger, and how the unknown is often better left unexplored. Stay safe out there, and trust your instincts. Some things are better left a mystery. When I was 17, I participated in an exchange program from Malaysia. My host family lived in Webster Groves, Missouri, a picturesque suburban town that seemed welcoming enough on the surface. They were a family of 4, a father, a mother, a teenage son, and a daughter just a year younger than me. At first, they seemed warm and kind, almost unnaturally so. I mistook their overzealous hospitality for American friendliness. I didn't realize then how much darker it would become. In the first week, I noticed strange things. Early one morning, I woke up earlier than usual and went to the kitchen, only to find the family gathered around the table in a tight circle. They were murmuring softly, their heads bowed. The moment I stepped into the room, they stopped abruptly and stared at me in silence, their eyes wide and unblinking. It was unsettling, but I brushed it off, thinking it might be some odd cultural quirk. By the second week, the atmosphere had shifted. The son outright avoided touching me and once hissed, "You're born of sin." The daughter seemed afraid to be alone with me and was visibly shaken when I addressed her father while looking him in the eye. Curious and increasingly uneasy, I started asking her questions about their behavior. She told me I had residues of the wicked and was destined for hell. She also mentioned something called the cleanse and their daily prayer washes. Over the next week, I started piecing together their practices. They recited the same hymns and Bible verses repeatedly, sometimes in eerie, monotonous tones. Their prayers were more like chants, growing louder and more fervent, sometimes lasting for hours. It became clear I wasn't just staying with a religious family, this was something much darker. The moment of truth came when they took me to their church. It wasn't the kind of church I had imagined. The small, dimly lit space was filled with men and women sitting separately, ribbons of different colors tied around their wrists. The children's faces were gaunt, their eyes hollow. No one spoke to me, and no one met my gaze except the pastor, who seemed to conduct the entire service with me as the focal point. When I looked around, everyone else was staring at me, their eyes wide and intense, as if waiting for something to happen. The chanting, the oppressive atmosphere, the sheer strangeness of it all made me feel like I was in a horror movie. School was on break, so I had no escape. At night, I'd often wake up to find the mother sitting in the dark next to my bed, softly reciting Bible verses. As soon as she realized I was awake, she'd stop, rise silently, and leave the room. I began to dread sleeping. By now, their behavior had escalated. I was punished for minor infractions. No dinner for not praying correctly, locked in my room for hours if I didn't respect their rules, forbidden from drinking anything sweet. They made me wear long-sleeved tops and skirts that covered me completely, even in the heat. They lectured me daily about how sinful I was, how my Oriental upbringing made me blind to the truth, and how I would burn in hell unless I submitted to their beliefs. It was suffocating, but my curiosity kept me grounded. I observed them closely, trying to understand their twisted logic. I think they assumed that, coming from Southeast Asia, I would be gullible and easy to manipulate. They underestimated me. Finally, my chapter coordinator came for a visit. I made sure to meet her outside, away from the house, and poured out everything that had happened. Her face grew increasingly alarmed as I spoke. Without hesitation, she told me to pack my essentials and leave with her immediately. We returned an hour later with representatives from the exchange program. When we arrived, the family was in the backyard, burning my belongings. Flames consumed my clothes, my books, even small trinkets I had brought from home. They called it a purification ritual for the sinful non-believer. I panicked, thinking my passport and other important documents might have been destroyed, but luckily, they were untouched. The family didn't protest as the representatives confronted them, but their expressions were eerie, smiling yet hostile, as if they believed they were righteous in their actions. It chilled me to my core. I was placed with a new host family immediately. They were kind and understanding, helping me rebuild my confidence after the ordeal. To this day, the memory of that month haunts me. It wasn't just the bizarre rituals or the constant scrutiny. It was the way they had dehumanized me, stripping me of my identity in their effort to convert me to their beliefs. The experience made me realize the thin line between faith and fanaticism, and how dangerous it can be to fall into the hands of those who blur that line. It was Derek's idea, as always. He had a knack for pulling us into adventures, his charm making it impossible to say no. "Picture it," he said, spreading his arms wide as if unveiling the perfect getaway. "An island paradise, no crowds, no distractions, just us and nature." The group loved the idea. Jordan and Maya were all in from the start, and Emily, ever the voice of reason, caved after a few minutes of Derek's coaxing. That left me. I was hesitant. Maybe it was because I'd never really traveled, or because my parents' strict rules growing up had left me with a cautious streak. Still, they wore me down. Derek always did. "It's just for a few days, Taylor," Emily had said, her tone soothing. "You'll have fun, I promise." I let myself believe her. The island was more remote than I expected. After a long ferry ride, we arrived at a tiny dock surrounded by dense jungle. The air was thick with humidity, and the only sound was the distant crash of waves. The cabin was perched on a cliff, with a stunning view of the ocean. It looked old, but solid, its wooden walls weathered by years of salt air. Inside, it was cozy enough. Basic, but with just enough charm to make me feel like I'd stepped into a postcard. That first day was everything Derek had promised. We swam in the turquoise water, explored hidden coves, and basked in the sun until our skin glowed. By evening, we were sitting around a fire pit outside the cabin, laughing and sharing stories. Still, something about the island felt off. At first, I chalked it up to my overactive imagination. The jungle seemed too quiet, the shadows too deep. Every now and then, I thought I saw movement in the trees, but when I looked closer, there was nothing there. "You okay?" Maya asked, nudging me. I forced a smile. "Yeah, just tired, I guess." But as the night went on, the uneasy feeling grew. I woke up suddenly, my chest tight. The cabin was dark, the faint sound of waves crashing in the distance. For a moment, I thought I'd had a nightmare, but as I lay there, listening, I heard it. A low, rhythmic chanting, coming from somewhere outside. I sat up, my heart racing. The sound was distant, almost like a breeze carrying whispers through the jungle. My friends' rooms were dark, their doors closed. I called out softly, "Derek? Emily?" But no one answered. Then I noticed the front door. It was slightly ajar, the humid night air spilling into the cabin. I hesitated, but the chanting was growing louder. I stepped outside, and that's when I saw the glow of firelight through the trees. My pulse quickened. "Derek?" I called again, louder this time. Still no response. Against my better judgment, I followed the light. The path was uneven, the jungle pressing in on all sides. The chanting grew louder with every step, the words unintelligible but strangely rhythmic, almost hypnotic. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The firelight grew brighter as I pushed through the underbrush until I finally reached a clearing and froze. There was a fire in the center, and around it stood a circle of people dressed in dark robes. Their faces were hidden by hoods, their chanting rising and falling in an eerie, unnatural cadence. At first, I thought I was looking at strangers, but then I saw them. Derek, Jordan, Maya, and Emily stood near the fire, their faces calm, almost serene. They weren't wearing robes, but they were chanting along with the others, their voices blending into the strange rhythm. I felt like the ground had dropped out from under me. I took a step back, panic clawing at my chest. That's when I saw the altar. It was a massive slab of stone, covered in strange carvings that seemed to writhe in the firelight. Dark stains marred its surface, and the air around it felt heavy, oppressive. I didn't realize I'd stepped on a branch until it snapped under my foot. The sound echoed through the clearing like a gunshot. The chanting stopped. Slowly, heads turned toward me. My friend's eyes locked onto mine, and Derek smiled, a slow, chilling smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Taylor," he said, his voice light, almost amused. "You're awake. Good. Come join us." My stomach twisted. What? What is this?" Maya took a step closer, her expression soft, almost pitying. "You weren't supposed to see this," she said. "Not yet, but it's okay. Everything's going to be fine." "Stay back," I said, my voice shaking. They didn't stop. "You're special, Taylor," Derek said. "You've always been different. That's why we brought you here." "What are you talking about?" I whispered, my hands trembling. "You're the sacrifice," Emily said, her voice soft, reverent. My blood turned to ice. I turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush. The jungle seemed alive, branches clawing at my face and arms. Behind me, I could hear the others calling out, their voices disturbingly calm despite my escape. "Taylor," Derek called, his voice cutting through the night like a blade. "You can't run from this. It's your destiny." I didn't look back. When I finally burst out onto the beach, the ferry was waiting. The captain saw me and started the engine as I sprinted toward the boat, my lungs burning. "Help!" I screamed, waving frantically. I glanced back and saw Derek, Jordan, Maya, and Emily emerging from the trees. They didn't shout or run after me. They just stood there, watching, their faces calm but their eyes dark with promise. I leapt onto the ferry, gasping for breath. "Don't let them on," I begged the captain. He nodded and pushed the throttle, the boat pulling away from the island. As the shoreline faded into the distance, I collapsed onto the deck, trembling. Even now, I can't escape the memory. I wake up hearing their chanting, seeing the altar, feeling their hands pulling me toward it. The island is still out there, and they're waiting for me to come back. I never thought I'd be telling this story. Even now, it feels surreal to look back on it. I was one of the survivors of the Jonestown tragedy, the mass loss of life that affected hundreds of people, and it still haunts me every single day. My name is Carla Mitchell, and I was one of those who got swept up in the promises of Jim Jones and his People's Temple. I didn't see it coming. At first, it all seemed so hopeful. I was living in San Francisco in the mid-1970s, just like many others looking for meaning in a world that felt increasingly unstable. There was so much division in the U.S., with politics tearing the country apart, and the Vietnam War still leaving its scars. The idea of a community that stood for social justice, equality, and a sense of family was intoxicating. Jim Jones promised all of that. He had a way with words, a kind of magnetic presence. He spoke about unity, about creating a better world, about rejecting the materialism of society and focusing on love and equality. It felt like a dream I couldn't resist. I joined the People's Temple in San Francisco, and in the beginning, it was everything I thought I needed. The temple was a place where I felt accepted, where I found people who were fighting for the same ideals as I was. We worked together, sang together, and helped each other through the struggles of life. Jim Jones, the man who built all of this, seemed like a father figure. He listened to us, made us feel heard, and made me believe that we could create something truly special. But, as with any story that ends in horror, things weren't as perfect as they seemed. As time passed, I noticed little things. The rules became stricter. Jim became more erratic. He started isolating us from the outside world. We couldn't watch the news or read newspapers. He began telling us that everyone outside the temple was the enemy, that the government, the media, the world itself was out to destroy us. He painted a picture of constant persecution. Slowly, the sense of community that once felt so warm and safe started to feel more like a prison. Then came the move to Jonestown. The dream of creating a self-sustaining community deep in the jungles of Guyana sounded like the next logical step in Jim's vision. A place where we could escape the corruptions of the outside world, where we could live in peace, free from the distractions of modern life. I thought I was going to help build something beautiful. I thought we would be happy there. But the moment we stepped foot in Jonestown, everything changed. The land was beautiful in its own way, but there was something unsettling about it. It was hot, isolated, and incredibly difficult to live in. The work was constant, building the infrastructure, farming, trying to make everything self-sufficient. We didn't have much, but we were told it would be worth it. "This is our paradise," Jim would say. But that paradise quickly became a nightmare. Jim's behavior got worse over time. He would rant for hours in his speeches, and the things he said became more erratic, more paranoid. He started to demand absolute loyalty from everyone. Anyone who dared question him was punished, ostracized, or, worse, disappeared. The tension in the air was thick. I knew something wasn't right, but the thought of leaving, of abandoning everything I had built with the temple, seemed impossible. But then came the day I realized I had to escape. It was the day they brought out the poisoned drink. It's hard to describe the feelings I had that day. Jim had gathered everyone in the central area of the compound, and he started talking about revolutionary sacrifice. He said that we had to show the world that we were committed to our cause, our commitment to his vision. And the way he spoke about it, the way he justified it, made it sound so final, so absolute. He made it seem like if we didn't do this, we were betraying everything we had worked for. I had seen people speak out, try to resist before, and each time, something terrible happened to them. They disappeared. Their voices, once loud with hope, were silenced. I knew this was different. This time, there was no way out, no easy escape. It wasn't just about the fear of leaving. It was the reality that anyone who didn't comply wouldn't survive. But in that moment, something inside me snapped. I couldn't do it. I couldn't drink the poison. I couldn't leave my life in the hands of a man who had manipulated us all for so long. I had to run. I don't even remember how I got away. I just remember the panic, the terror, The sounds of people crying, the shouts of others begging for their lives, the cold realization that this was it. This was the end for so many. Somehow, I found a way out. I ran through the jungle, the dense trees and thick brush making it almost impossible to see where I was going. My heart was racing, my body was exhausted, and I knew there was a chance someone would catch me, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't let it end like that. I ran for hours, not knowing if I was going in the right direction, just hoping that somewhere someone would help me. I finally collapsed. I don't know how long I lay there, hours, maybe even a day, but when I woke up, I was alone. The jungle was quiet. I didn't hear the sounds of the compound anymore, the chants, the orders. I was free. But the freedom felt like a weight on my chest. The guilt, the grief, the pain of leaving behind everyone I had once considered family, it all came flooding back. Eventually, I made it to a place where I could reach the outside world. But even when I finally got to a phone, I couldn't believe it. The news was everywhere. Jonestown was no more. Hundreds of people, including children, were gone. The people I had called friends, the people I had worked beside, they were dead. The world would never know the full scope of what had happened in that jungle. But I did. I came back to the States, but I was different. How could I not be? I had lived through something unimaginable, and I had lost so much. The years that followed were a blur of therapy, support groups, and trying to put together the pieces of my life. I couldn't trust people. I couldn't trust myself. The guilt ate at me every day. Why had I survived? Why had they not? But over time, I found a way to heal. It wasn't easy. It still isn't. But I dedicated my life to helping others, survivors, people who had gone through similar things, anyone who needed to hear that they weren't alone. I speak now, when I can, to make sure that what happened in Jonestown is never forgotten. And though I will never forget the people I lost there, I keep moving forward. Because the most important lesson I've learned is that even in the darkest moments, there is a way to survive. I used to be someone I can't even recognize now. Back then, I was deep in it. The darkness, the rituals, the secrecy. It felt like a lifetime ago, but it wasn't. It was just a few months. A few months that have stained my soul forever. I wasn't born evil, I didn't seek it out, but somewhere along the way, I got caught. I didn't see it happening at first. You never do you? It's like slowly sinking into a pool of tar, and by the time you realize you're drowning, it's too late to escape. I had my reasons for joining. I was lost. I was looking for purpose, for meaning in a world that seemed so hollow. The cult promised something beyond the mundane, something powerful, something transcendent. At first, it was easy to ignore the whispers, the rumors about what they actually did behind closed doors. I was new, naive, desperate for a place to belong. And they welcomed me in. They promised me power, the kind of power that came with obedience, with sacrifice. The first ritual was subtle. Just a few candles, a chant, an offering. It was almost laughable if you hadn't seen what came after. I was naive then, not realizing that the true horror wasn't in the ritual itself, but in what the cult made you willing to do. They said it was for the greater good, for the enlightenment of the soul. We called it the binding, but it was a lie. It was a trap. It was when they tied your soul to their will, a permanent link that would never let go. We didn't start with anything too extreme. We were told we were cleansing the world, ridding it of corruption. And the first blood we spilled, it felt justified somehow. It was always framed in terms of purification. They'd tell all of us, that the innocent ones we hurt, those we sacrificed, were the corrupt ones, the ones holding us all back. In the beginning, I didn't see it. I didn't see how easily we were manipulated, how slowly they made us numb. The longer I stayed, the more violent the rituals became. I became numb to it all. Their leader, the one they called the Shrouded One, would stand in the center, his black robes flowing like smoke around him. His voice was hypnotic, the way it reverberated in your chest, making your heart race in anticipation. He promised us power, enlightenment, immortality if we followed his path. But the rituals, the sacrifices, they were becoming more elaborate, more horrific. They had us carve symbols into the skin of the living, chanting words I couldn't understand. At first, I thought it was a necessary evil, an act for a higher cause, but the moment I saw the eyes of a child, terrified and pleading, as the knife was raised, that's when everything began to crack. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in my cot, staring at the ceiling, hearing the echoes of the child's cries in my mind. I didn't want to think about it, but I couldn't help myself. I had been complicit. I had participated. My hands had been covered in that innocent blood, just like everyone else's, and no amount of chanting could erase what I had done. No amount of power could bring that child back. I couldn't stand it anymore. But leaving, trying to escape, it wasn't easy. The cult doesn't just let you go. It binds you, traps you. It's not just loyalty they demand, it's a piece of your soul. They made sure we couldn't leave, had us marked, each of us branded with their symbol. A symbol that twisted and burned into my skin like it was part of me, part of my very being. I remember the night I decided to leave. We were preparing for the most elaborate ritual yet. A blood moon, they called it. A rare event that supposedly opened the gates to another realm. They spoke of summoning gods, of bending the very fabric of reality to our will. But when I looked into the eyes of the person lying on the altar, another victim, a stranger who had been lured in under the pretense of protection, I realized I was no different from the others. We were all just pawns in a game that didn't care who lived or died, and that realization was like a knife in my chest. I had to escape. I had to run, no matter the cost. The night I left, I thought I could just slip away unnoticed, but I was wrong. They knew. They always know. The Shrouded One's eyes were like fire when he saw me. "You can never leave," he hissed, his voice low and dangerous. "You belong to us. You always will." But I ran. I ran until my legs burned, until my breath came in ragged gasps. I didn't stop, not even when I heard the distant howls, the chants in the night that seemed to call my name. I made it to the outskirts of the town, to the place where they couldn't reach me. But the damage had already been done. The memories haunted me, the faces of those I'd hurt, the screams of the innocent that echoed in my ears. Every night I relived those moments, the child on the altar, the blood, the rituals. I couldn't wash it off. I couldn't forget. The mark on my skin, the symbol they branded me with, it's still there. A constant reminder of the monster I once was, and it will never fade. I wish I could say I came out of it unscathed. I wish I could say that leaving them was the end of it, but it's not. Every night the dreams come. The cult doesn't let go. I hear the chants, see the blood. I see their faces, those who are still trapped in the web they wove, and it fills me with guilt. I left, but I didn't stop them. I couldn't stop them. And now I live with the consequences of my actions. Every minute is a reminder of what I did, of what I was. I used to think I could outrun my past, but the truth is, no matter how far I go, I'll always carry it with me. The weight of the blood on my hands, the souls I helped destroy, the lives I helped ruin. It will never leave me. I can never go back. I can never undo what I did. All I can do is try to make amends, if that's even possible, and hope that somehow, in the end, I'll be able to forgive myself. But I don't think I will. Because when you cross a line like I did, there's no going back. And the cult will always be there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the next person they can twist and warp. The rain slicked the pavement under my feet as I stood outside the abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. The cold bit through my jacket, but I barely felt it. My mind was consumed by the task at hand. I was about to infiltrate one of the most secretive and dangerous cults known to exist, the Children of the Veil. For months, I had heard whispers about them. Rituals in the dead of night, cryptic symbols etched into walls, and people who disappeared without a trace. Their name kept surfacing in connection with missing persons cases that law enforcement conveniently dismissed as unrelated. It wasn't unrelated. I knew it wasn't. One of those missing persons was my brother Sam. The invitation I held in my hand was my golden ticket. It had taken weeks of false identities, staged encounters, and carefully planted rumors to convince one of their members to recommend me. The card was simple, a black rectangle with a crimson symbol embossed in its center, the mark of the veil. The instructions were on the back, written in an archaic script I had painstakingly learned to read. I took a deep breath, pushed the heavy metal door open, and stepped inside. My footsteps echoed through the cavernous space. The air was thick with the smell of damp concrete and something faintly metallic. Dim red light illuminated the interior, casting eerie shadows that danced on the walls. A hooded figure stood at the far end of the room, motionless. "You're late," the figure said, the voice low and distorted, as though masked by some device. "Traffic," I replied, keeping my tone even. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure they could hear it. The figure stepped closer, and I could make out the intricate patterns embroidered on their black robe. They inspected me for a moment before nodding. "Follow me." I did as I was told, trailing the figure through a maze of corridors that seemed to spiral deeper and deeper underground. The walls were covered in strange symbols and murals depicting scenes I could barely comprehend. Hooded figures kneeling before a glowing portal, shadowy shapes emerging from the darkness, and eyes, hundreds of eyes, watching from every corner. Finally, we entered a large chamber filled with people, all dressed in similar robes. They stood in concentric circles around a raised platform in the center. On the platform was a massive stone altar, its surface stained dark. Candles flickered around the room, their flames casting a wavering light that seemed to make the symbols on the walls writhe. "Brothers and sisters," a voice boomed from the platform. I turned my attention to the figures standing there. Their robe was more elaborate than the others, adorned with gold and crimson embroidery. "Tonight, we welcome a new seeker into our fold." Every head turned to me. I fought the urge to take a step back. "Step forward," the leader commanded. I moved to the center of the room, acutely aware of every eye on me. The leader gestured to the altar. kneel. I hesitated for a fraction of a second before complying. My knees hit the cold stone, and I placed my hands on the altar as instructed. The leader began to chant, a low, guttural sound that sent shivers down my spine. The others joined in, their voices creating a dissonant harmony that seemed to vibrate through the very air. As the chant reached a crescendo, I felt a sharp pain in my palm. I looked down to see a blade slicing across my skin, wielded by the leader. Blood pooled on the altar and the room seemed to darken. The chanting grew louder, almost deafening. Shadows moved unnaturally, and the symbols on the walls began to glow faintly. And then, silence. Complete and utter silence. The leader spoke again, their voice cutting through the stillness. "You have shed your blood for the veil. Now, you must prove your loyalty." A door opened on the far side of the chamber, revealing another hooded figure dragging a bound and gagged man into the room. My stomach twisted. The man's eyes were wide with terror, and his muffled cries echoed in the silence. "He is an outsider," the leader said. "A threat to our purpose. Eliminate him." A knife was placed in my hand. My mind raced. This was the test. If I refused, my cover would be blown, and I'd likely share the man's fate. But if I went through with it, could I ever live with myself? I took a step toward the man, my hand trembling. His eyes locked onto mine, pleading. I hesitated, the weight of the knife feeling unbearable. "Do it," the leader hissed. The room seemed to close in around me, the pressure almost suffocating. I made my decision. In one swift motion, I turned and drove the knife into the leader's chest. Gasps and cries erupted around the chamber. Chaos ensued as I grabbed the bound man and bolted for the door. Behind me, shouts and footsteps echoed as the cultists gave chase. Somehow, we made it out of the warehouse and into the night. My heart was racing, adrenaline coursing through my veins. The man I had saved was still shaking, but he managed to choke out a "thank you." We didn't stop running until we reached the safety of the city streets. I turned to him, breathing heavily. "Do you know anything about my brother? Sam, he's missing." The man's eyes widened. "Sam, they took him, but he's alive. I've seen him." Relief and determination surged through me. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The children of the Veil had taken my brother, and now they would pay. They say the worst betrayals come from those closest to you. I never truly understood that until the day I discovered who my husband really was. For years, I had been living in a lie so intricate, so meticulously woven, that it had become the fabric of my reality. But the threads unraveled quickly when the truth surfaced, leaving me gasping for air in a world that suddenly felt foreign. It all started on a humid Thursday evening. I was cleaning out the attic, rummaging through dusty boxes filled with old photo albums and forgotten trinkets. I'd always known Peter was a private man, mysterious even. But in the 11 years we'd been married, he'd never given me a reason to doubt him. We were happy, or so I thought. One of the boxes caught my eye. It was tucked away in the farthest corner of the attic, covered in cobwebs and marked with a name I didn't recognize, Elias Blackwood. I stared at it for a moment, my curiosity piqued. Peter had never mentioned an Elias Blackwood, and the name felt too strange to ignore. With a hesitant breath, I opened the box. Inside, I found documents, photographs, and letters that painted a chilling picture. There were old black and white photos of Peter, except he wasn't Peter. He looked younger, his hair styled differently, but it was undoubtedly him. In some of the photos, he stood surrounded by men and women dressed in robes, their faces shrouded by hoods. In others, he was standing on a podium, speaking to crowds of people whose faces were twisted in rapturous devotion. Then there were the letters, dozens of them, signed Alias, or EB, and addressed to someone named Brother Samuel. As I read, my stomach churned. The letters spoke of unity and purity, of eradicating the tainted and restoring the true order. It didn't take long to piece together the horrifying truth. My husband was the leader of a violent, racist cult. I didn't realize I was shaking until one of the letters slipped from my trembling hands. I sat back on my heels, staring at the pile of evidence before me, my mind racing. How could I not have known? How could I have shared my life, my bed, with someone capable of such hatred? Memories of Peter flashed through my mind, his charm, his wit, the way he always knew how to make me laugh. But now those memories felt tainted, like an oil slick spreading across the surface of clear water. I spent the rest of the evening poring over the contents of that box. The more I read, the clearer the picture became. Elias Blackwood wasn't just an alias. It was an identity my husband had assumed years before we met. He had been the leader of a group called the Ascendants, a cult that preached racial supremacy and carried out acts of violence in the name of their twisted beliefs. According to the documents, the group had disbanded after a federal raid over a decade ago, and Elias Blackwood had supposedly vanished. But he hadn't vanished. He'd reinvented himself as Peter Callahan, the charming, unassuming man who had swept me off my feet. I barely slept that night. By morning, I had made up my mind to confront him. When Peter came home from work, I was waiting for him in the living room. The box sat on the coffee table between us, its contents spread out like evidence in a courtroom. "What is this?" I demanded, my voice trembling with anger and fear. Peter froze. His eyes darted to the box, then back to me. For a moment, he didn't say anything. Then he let out a slow breath and sank into the armchair across from me. "I was going to tell you," he said finally, his voice calm, almost detached. "Someday." "Someday?" I repeated, my voice rising. "You are going to tell me someday that you led a racist cult? That you've been living a lie our entire marriage? Who are you, Peter, or should I call you Elias?" His expression darkened. "I'm the same man you married, Caroline, the same man who loves you." "Don't you dare," I snapped, my hands clenched into fists. "Don't you dare say you love me. You don't even know what love is." For the first time, a flicker of something resembling guilt crossed his face. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared. "It's not as simple as you think," he said. "The Ascendants were misguided. I've changed. I left that life behind." "You left it behind?" I gestured to the box. "Then why do you still have this? Why keep the photos, the letters?" He didn't answer. Instead, he leaned forward, his eyes locking onto mine. "Caroline, you have to understand. Everything I did back then, I thought I was doing for the right reasons. I thought I was protecting something important. But I see things differently now. I've moved on." "Have you?" I asked, my voice cracking. "Or are you just hiding, waiting for the right moment to pick up where you left off?" Peter didn't respond. The silence between us was heavy, suffocating. I realized then that I couldn't trust a word he said. The man I thought I knew was a stranger, and the life we'd built together was a house of cards, ready to collapse. That night, I packed a bag and left. As I drove away from the home we'd shared, I felt a mix of heartbreak and relief. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing for certain. I could never go back to a life built on lies. I didn't think much of it when Sophia first invited me to one of the meetings. We were both fresh out of college, stuck in dead-end jobs, and she said it helped her clear her mind or see the bigger picture. At the time, I just thought it sounded better than drinking alone on a Friday night. The whispering path wasn't what I expected. No candles, no robes, no chanting in basements. The meetings were held in places that felt too mundane to be unsettling. Cafes, libraries, even once in the back room of a community center. They called themselves a collective of seekers. People looking for deeper understanding, unity, or whatever other vague spiritual buzzwords were trending that year. At first, it was harmless. Discussions about self-improvement, group meditation, sharing your dreams and ambitions with strangers who listened without judgment. I'd seen worse cults on YouTube documentaries. Then came the invitation to the retreat. "It's not mandatory," Sophia said, handing me a folded flyer, "but it's transformative, life-changing." The flyer was printed on thick paper, gold and black, with an address nestled in the hills 2 hours outside the city. A weekend to align with the universal flow, it promised. I wasn't sold, but something about Sophia's earnest expression made me agree. That's how I ended up carpooling with 4 strangers on a freezing November evening, winding through dark forest roads. The cabin was larger than I expected, its sloped roof almost blending into the surrounding pines. Warm light spilled from the windows, and a dozen cars were parked haphazardly on the gravel. I told myself it was just another weekend getaway, a fancy meditation retreat with some weirdos, nothing sinister. Inside, it smelled of cedar and sage. People milled about, chatting in low voices. There were familiar faces from the meetings, but also others I didn't recognize. Elias Thorne, the group's founder, stood near the fireplace, greeting everyone like an old friend. He wasn't what I expected either. Mid-40s, clean-cut, with sharp eyes that seemed to catch every movement in the room. "Welcome, Emma," he said when I approached. His handshake was firm, his smile warm, but something about him made me uneasy. The first night passed without incident. We ate a vegetarian dinner, listened to Elias speak about connecting to the flow, and ended with a group meditation. Some people were emotional, tearing up as they shared their experiences afterward. I felt nothing. It was the second night when things started to unravel. The evening began with another meditation session, but this time, Elias added a trust exercise. We were blindfolded and asked to let go of our fears by walking through the forest, guided only by the hand of a partner. When they tied the cloth over my eyes, I could feel my heart pounding. I wasn't afraid of the dark or the woods, but something about being led blind felt wrong. "Vulnerable, relax," my partner whispered. His hand was clammy, his grip too tight. "Just keep walking." The forest floor was uneven, roots and rocks snagging at my boots. I couldn't see, but I could hear the others around me. Footsteps crunching leaves, nervous laughter, someone muttering prayers under their breath. After what felt like hours, we stopped. "Take off your blindfolds." Elias's voice rang out from somewhere ahead. When I did, the first thing I noticed was the sky. It was too clear, the stars impossibly bright, almost vibrating against the blackness. Around me, the others were murmuring in awe, pointing upward. But something felt off. "Look closer," Elias said, his voice low and urgent. I squinted at the stars. At first, it seemed like nothing, just constellations and faraway light. But then I noticed the way they moved, slowly shifting, forming patterns that didn't make sense. They weren't twinkling, they were pulsing. A ripple of unease swept through the group. Someone muttered, "What is that?" "It's the flow," Elias said. His voice was calm, almost hypnotic. "We're seeing the flow." Sophia was beside me, her face lit with wonder. "Do you see it, Emma?" I nodded, even though my stomach was churning. The stars weren't supposed to do that. Then the wind picked up, cold and biting. The trees swayed, their branches creaking, but the sound was wrong. Low, guttural, almost like a growl. "Stay calm," Elias said, but his voice was drowned out by a sudden noise, a sharp, crackling sound, like static. The stars began to blur, their light bleeding into the sky, forming shapes that felt alive. I took a step back, my head spinning. Around me, others were reacting too, some crying, others laughing hysterically. "This isn't right," I whispered, but no one heard me. Sophia grabbed my arm. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" "No," I said, yanking my arm away. "We need to leave." She just stared at me, her eyes wide, unblinking. And that's when I realized she wasn't seeing the same thing I was. Panic set in as I turned to run, but the forest didn't look the same. The trees seemed closer, their trunks impossibly tall, their branches twisting like claws. The path we'd come from was gone, replaced by a tangle of shadows. Behind me, Elias was still speaking, his voice calm and steady, but his words didn't make sense anymore. They were sounds, syllables strung together in a language I didn't recognize. I ran. Branches tore at my jacket, roots tripped me, but I kept going, my breath loud and ragged in my ears. The stars above were still shifting, growing brighter, casting the forest in an eerie silver light. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually I found the road. The others didn't follow, and I didn't look back.